Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So a man and woman found unconscious in Wiltshire were exposed to Novichok, close to where the same nerve agent was used to poison ex-Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. Charlie Rowley and Dawn Sturgis, who fell ill at a house in Amesbury on Saturday, are in a critical condition. Let's talk to our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. Frank, how do we think this has happened?
Well, they displayed symptoms which initially were thought to be the effects of some kind of recreational drug, but subsequently showed to be the danger signs of nerve agent poisoning. That he was said to be foaming at the mouth and incoherent, pinpointed pupils. These are the very similar symptoms to those experienced by the Skripals back in March. So they've been rushed to Salisbury, or taken to Salisbury District Hospital, and they're getting advice. The people working on them are getting advice from Portendown, which is the nearby Government Defence Science Technology Laboratory. And it's that expertise which saved Sergei Skripal from the effects of nerve agent poisoning from this Novichok.
What, and will it tell us any more about the origins of the Novichok that was used to poison the Skripals?
I think probably for that they're going to have to wait for these two to come round and be able to be questioned by counter-terrorism police detectives and scientists working on this, because we don't yet know, or at least it's not out in the public domain, what it is exactly that they touched or ingested that poisoned them in this way. Was it a syringe? Was it a cigarette? Now, there is a new development on this, which probably hasn't been picked up yet, I think, by most of the media, which is that Vilmir Ryazanov, who is the former Soviet scientist who worked on Novichok when Russia was part of the Soviet Union, he has said in the last few minutes that Novichok actually isn't stable enough to be able to survive 4 months out in the open. Therefore, this would make it a new attack. Now, that's just one person's view, and that may not be the view of the scientists at Portendown, because so far the consensus view, and there's a COBRA meeting going on right now in Whitehall, that's the Cabinet Office briefing room, Government Emergency Crisis meeting. The consensus view is that this is leftover stuff from the March attack. But if he's right, then that would make this a new batch. And of course, all of this comes at a time when Russia is hosting the World Cup. Right,
well, that would add a layer of complexity to the whole situation, Frank, if you say that is the case. I mean, let's talk about the political implications with Russia. You mentioned the World Cup. We've just had a comment from the Kremlin, from Dmitry Peskov, who was asked for his reaction to the news, obviously denying it. Russia categorically and continues to categorically deny any involvement in what happened in Salisbury, and goes on to say you also know that the British side hasn't provided any convincing evidence to prove the unfounded accusations it made against Russia. You know that from the beginning the Russian side proposed a joint investigation with Britain, and this offer went unanswered. So there is still this sort of intransigence, if you like, in terms of any meeting of minds over an investigation.
Yes, I mean, there's enormous suspicion in Russia, not just in the Kremlin, but in the media and amongst ordinary Russians, that this is in some way a case of sour grapes by Britain, who relations were very bad between London and Moscow. Russia is hosting this very successful World Cup, and there's a feeling, I think, certainly in the media in Russia, that this is a desperate attempt by the British government to in some way undermine the glorious Russian World Cup. And that it's been somehow self-inflicted. The fact that Portendown, the government's chemical weapons defence establishment, is so close to where these poisonings have taken place has been seized on by the Russian media to say, aha, you know, it must have leaked from there, and they're just looking for somebody to blame. Let's blame Russia.
Frank Gardner, thank you very much. Sarah, listening to that, how concerned are you in terms of a risk to public health? I'm sure it's extremely alarming for anyone living in the area. Does it say to you anything about the clean-up operation and how effective that was?
I think it's too early to say, and I think we should be guided by Sally Davies on the risk. She's the Chief Medical Officer, so I don't think it would be right for me to add to what she has said. But what I would say is that the work at Portendown isn't just the Defence Science Lab, it's the extraordinary work that's done by Public Health England there in so many areas So, you know, I think on the 70th anniversary, I'd also draw attention to how important that work is.
All right, let's leave it there.
The Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, has called on Russia to explain the latest nerve agent attack that has left 2 people from Amesbury in Wiltshire critically ill in hospital. They were taken ill on Saturday, just 8 miles from Salisbury, where the former Russian spy, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter were poisoned in March. Mr. Javid told MPs he would not tolerate British parks and streets becoming a dumping ground for poison. Moscow has denied being involved in either of the incidents. This afternoon, Public Health England has again tried to reassure people in Amesbury and Salisbury, saying the risk to the public remains low. From there, June Kelly reports.
This secluded new housing estate in rural Wiltshire is now part of what has become an expanding police investigation. This was the scene this afternoon at the home of Charlie Rowley in Amesbury. Dawn Sturgis and Charlie Rowley fell ill on Saturday, and both are critical in intensive care. Last night came confirmation that they'd been poisoned by the nerve agent Novichok.
Can you provide reassurance for the people of Salisbury?
In London, 4 months on from the attack on Sergei and Yulia Skripal, the government's emergency committee was meeting once again. Later, the Home Secretary briefed the House of Commons.
There is no evidence that either the man or the woman in hospital visited any of the places that were visited by the Skripals. Our strong working assumption is that the couple came into contact with the nerve agent in a different location to the sites which have been part of the original clean-up operation.
In Wiltshire, a number of locations linked to the couple are now cordoned off. In Amesbury, there's Charlie Rowley's flat in Muggleton Road. Also closed off is a Baptist centre nearby and a local branch of Boots the Chemist. In Salisbury, 8 miles away, a hostel, John Baker House in Rolleston Street, where Dawn Sturgis lived, has now been closed. So too have the Queen Elizabeth Gardens in the city. The gardens are close to the Malting shopping centre and a bench where Sergei and Yulia Skripal were found collapsed in March. The Skripal home is also nearby. Charlie Rowley was at this church social event on Saturday.
They looked a bit out of sorts. You could just sense there was something not right. One would have assumed it was possibly alcohol. We don't know for sure.
Not long afterwards, he collapsed at his home. This footage shows him being taken into Salisbury General Hospital. Dawn Sturgis had already been admitted, as a friend who didn't want to appear on screen described.
On Saturday morning, I got a phone call. I was told that basically she got rushed into hospital. She'd basically passed out.
It was the skill of the staff at Salisbury General which saved Sergei and Yulia Skripal. This evening, police said that in the first search of Charlie Rowley's house, officers found items which suggested that a batch of illegal drugs may have been involved. Now they know that once again they're dealing with a deadly nerve agent. Well, 100 counter-terrorism detectives are working on this investigation, and the big questions for officers are how and where this couple came to be contaminated. Now, in terms of the how, within the past half hour, Scotland Yard have said that they handled a contaminated item, and earlier it was being suggested that this could have been a vial or a syringe because of this couple's lifestyle. But the investigation goes on, and this evening we have heard from the police that they believe that more officers will be brought in, and that the public, though, should be reassured that despite this police presence, this area is safe.
June Kelly, thank you. Well, the authorities have been trying to reassure the public, stressing that the risk remains low and no one else has presented with the same symptoms. Police say the initial areas that were involved in the Skripal attack have been fully decontaminated. John Kay reports from Amesbury.
For Chloe, it is all too close to home. She lives just yards from the property where the couple collapsed. So she's taking no chances. Following the official advice, she is washing her clothes and wiping down her possessions.
So we're just going to have to, I guess, keep waiting.
She told me it was worrying that it took 4 days to identify the nerve agent.
It was hard not knowing because we just didn't know what to do. We just didn't want to assume something, but I guess we assumed the worst, and the worst was what we got.
For friends and relatives of the critically ill couple, the wait for answers is even tougher.
1 minute they were fine, the next minute they were in intensive care. It's a bit scary.
Salisbury, 8 miles from the couple's home. This is the shopping centre where the Skripals collapsed after being poisoned in March. After a marketing push, things were just returning to normal here when news broke of this latest Novichok alert.
Oh my God, where's it come from?
Despite assurances that the risk to the public is low, Jenny, a grandmother, told me she's still anxious.
You just don't know, do you?
What frightens you particularly?
The fact that this time it's just two people, two random people, and it could be any of us. It's where's it come from, how's it happened, why's it happened, and we don't seem to be told that much. We're told enough to frighten us, but not to put our minds at rest.
The bench where the Skripals fell ill in March has now gone, replaced with summer flowers.
Today, lovely bargains, starting you out £1.
Daniel Stiles has a fruit stall right next to it. He says business was beginning to recover when this latest major incident was declared.
It can be a bit worrying knowing that, it's here and there, but that's, you can worry until the cows come home, or you can just get on with your life. They're the choices you make.
And that's what you're doing, just getting on with it?
Yeah, just get on with it.
So despite having some answers tonight, people here have many more questions. The main one, could it happen again? John Kay, BBC News, Wiltshire.
Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera is with me now, and the police have just said in the last half hour that the couple did touch something. Do we know what it was?
What they've said is they believe that they were contaminated by an item that they handled. Now, my understanding is police don't know exactly what that item is. They don't have it yet, but they believe it may well be some kind of container or receptacle used to carry Novichok. And the understanding that the contamination on the couple came from handling is based on the strongest concentration being on their hands when they've been tested in hospital. Now, this still means that the most plausible line of inquiry remains that this was an item discarded after the attack on the Skripals, which this couple then picked up. Now, they still don't know that for sure, and there are still other options, and they're keeping an open mind, but this still points in that direction.
Well, still very mysterious, but the Home Secretary has pointed the finger very firmly again at Russia.
Yes, that's right. The Home Secretary talked about Russia using Britain as a dumping ground for poisons and called on Russia to cooperate. At the same time, we've had a strong Russian response. They've always said they wanted a joint investigation into the Skripal poisoning, and they've suggested that this was even part of trying to spoil the World Cup. Because the World Cup was going well, Britain was trying to point the finger back at Russia over this poisoning. So I think we can expect more of a war of words between the two sides in the days to come.
Gordon Carrera, thank you.
The mystery over the second case of Novichok poisoning in Wiltshire deepens. 100 counter-terrorism officers are working to gather clues tonight on when, where and how Dawn Sturgis and Charlie Rowley were contaminated with the nerve agent, which has left them in a critical condition. The Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, has lashed out at Russia, accusing it of using Britain as a poison dumping ground. Our reporter, Porrick O'Brien, is in Salisbury. Porrick.
So, John, we've spent the day talking to people, friends of the couple who were poisoned last weekend, trying to sort of piece together what actually happened on the day, people that were actually with them on that Friday. So let me talk you through some of the things that they got up to before the actual poisoning itself. First of all, the building behind me is a homeless shelter, and at some point in the evening, the couple were inside. Now, yesterday, we could walk up and down that street freely, and that'll give you some idea of how this whole has accelerated. Now it's behind a police barrier with forensic tents behind. Before they went to the homeless shelter, they went shopping, basically, in central Salisbury. And we can show you footage now of one of the places they visited. It's an off-licence in the middle of town. You can see Dawn Sturgis walking around to the shelves. You can see her going up to the counter. A normal sort of sunny Friday afternoon in Wiltshire, a trip to the off-licence. And then, of course, they made their way to a park in town, Queen Elizabeth Gardens. After that, they return to they come back to the hostel here, and then Dawn and Charlie make their way to Charlie's house, which we were in yesterday, which is in Amesbury, a little way out of town. That's some of the details, but step back from a moment. Remember, we have 4 people now, if you including the Skripals, who are in a critical condition after a military-grade nerve agent in a Wiltshire town. Salisbury, the incongruous setting for an ongoing international incident. involving military-grade nerve agent and lives hanging in the balance, poisoned by Novichok, as per the Skripal's attack. The Home Secretary pulling no punches, punches aimed at Russia.
It is now time that the Russian state comes forward and explains exactly what has gone on. It is completely unacceptable for our people to be either deliberate or accidental targets, or for our streets, our parks, our towns to be dumping grounds for poison.
We spent today talking to the people who were actually with Charlie Rowley and Dawn Sturges last Friday in the park behind me to try to piece together how it could have been that the couple were poisoned by the same nerve agent, Novichok, as was used in the Skripal's attack. The attention today is here on Queen Elizabeth Gardens in the centre of Salisbury, just 5 minutes' walk from Zizi's, where traces of the nerve agent used to poison the Skripals were found. The gardens were not one of the decontamination zones in April. But once they got to the park, what happened? It's likely that the Novichok in the Skripals attack was delivered in a vial or syringe. One working theory is that Dawn Sturges found something that day, possibly discarded after the original attack. Later in the day, she handed it to her partner, Charlie. She got infected first because she touched it first. Now, we put that theory to one of the friends that was with Dawn and Charlie in the park on Friday. He says that although the couple had problems with addiction, they were not using syringes on the day. He says it's more likely, in fact, that Dawn picked up something like a cigarette butt, and that's how she became affected. He was also with Charlie the following morning after Dawn had been admitted into hospital, and he says Charlie told him that Charlie had tried to do CPR and mouth-to-mouth on Dawn when she started to get ill, and that's why Charlie may have become seriously ill, but sometime later. This is, of course, conjecture from people who were there. One of them, who didn't want to go on camera, did want people to know that their addiction is not the focus now.
That's not the real issue. The real issue is that they've been caught up in something simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
After the park, the group went to John Baker House, a homeless shelter where Dawn Sturges was staying. The couple later spent the night at Charlie Rowley's house in Muggleton Road, Amesbury. The following day, they were both admitted to hospital. Today, police reiterated that this is a fast-moving, complex investigation. But, bizarrely, one of the friends who we spoke to, part of the group of 5 in the park that day, has not yet been approached by the police. Has anyone from the police force or the medical profession been in contact with you about getting checked up, or...?
No.
And have you thought about going to anyone just to be on the safe side, or...?
I haven't, no, to be honest, no.
Salisbury is a town reeling, not once but twice, from what's happened.
Shocked, really shocked, annoyed, frustrated, because Salisbury's being put on the map for a negative rather than all the positive that we've got to offer. It's just really, really frustrating, and whatever's going on, we just want it to end. We want it to stop, get back to some normality.
Now that it's happening again, it kind of makes you question, was the clean-up done properly or whatever?
It all has local, national, transnational ramifications. At its heart, though, a collection of families, including Stephen and Caroline Sturges, Dawn's elderly parents. We spoke to their neighbours today in the village of Durlington. They told us that at 6 o'clock this morning, Stephen and Caroline, along with Dawn's 2 sisters, went off again to the hospital to spend another day by Dawn's bedside.
Porrick O'Brien in Salisbury. We're now in Russia. The fresh accusations surrounding this second case of Novichok poisoning have been met so far with official restraint and dismay. The Kremlin has expressed concern while denying any involvement in the poisonings, but one Russian MP described the case as part of British efforts to tarnish the World Cup in Russia and fuel tensions ahead of the US-Russian summit. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, is in Russia. Alex.
Yes, John, we'll come to the politics in a second, but dismay, Russia really reiterating from the Kremlin the 2 central points, which has always really been the basis of their response to this. Firstly, they say, made repeated attempts to try and help the British authorities investigate. Now, some may greet that with mirth and contempt from a country for which there is evidence that they were behind the Alexander Litvinenko poisoning some years ago. Be that as it may, from the Kremlin's perspective, they say these are genuine entreaties and we've been completely ignored, and there is some dismay about that. More centrally, and here the Russians have the support of other European governments, like the Germans, for example, is the simple fact that the British have never put forward any evidence to connect this Novichok poisoning with the Skripals and possibly with this new couple with the Russian state, indeed with Russia at all. The British have only ever said it's a Novichok agent of a type manufactured by Russia. That language is important. That was really expressed today by the Kremlin's key spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. He was giving one of his radio interviews to various journalists, which he does on a regular basis. Have a listen to what he said.
You also know that the British side did not present any convincing proof for its ungrounded accusations against Russia on its involvement in the case. You know that the Russian side suggested a joint investigation to the British colleagues. This suggestion was left without the answer.
Alex, is it even big news in Russia?
Oh, boy, yes, it is, John. Yes, lead item on all the main bulletins. Just random, really. Have a look at these pictures. This is the News 24, Russia 24 channel today, the biggest news channel in the country. Their lead story, they're talking about it. So go all the other main channels in Russia. The coverage very much, I suspect, what you're getting in Britain. The few facts as we know them, who these people were, where the contamination happened and so forth, being put over pretty much in the way that they probably are in the UK, I'm sure. One thing you notice, the televised statements from Scotland Yard carried at great length here and dutifully translated. Then, of course, matters change a little bit, and I suspect they change here in Russia in the same way that they change in the UK. To this regard, this is someone who's been doing the rounds today. This is Igor Morozov, who's a former military intelligence background in the upper house. He says this is all a distraction. They're trying to smear the World Cup here, as other deputies have said. He also says it's all about Theresa May shoring up her own position within her cabinet. She's a weak prime minister. It's all about distraction and so forth. So that's the view. To sum it up, frankly, there are politicians in Russia, there are politicians in the UK, both sets of them, on the basis of almost no hard evidence whatsoever, are making politics out of this and drawing conclusions on the basis of their own politics, not of the facts, because there are very few facts. John.
Alex Thompson in Russia. Now, joining us in the studio is Dr. Sally Leavesley, who is a security specialist. She worked at the Home Office as a scientific advisor on nuclear, chemical and biological threats. And the first question I think people are bound to have is, would it be easy to distinguish the first batch that attacked, that struck the Skripals, if indeed this is the same or indeed a different batch?
Well, interestingly, it may be the same batch but mixed at a different time. So what the scientists will be trying to do will be probably compare some of the material they'll have from the Skripal incident and see how that's aged and whether this matches it in age, because we've got 4 months. And what's a little bit out of sync here is that this seems to have had the same process of effect on these two new and very sadly new victims, but a decayed product may not have operated in that way.
And it should have decayed, you're arguing?
The expectation, if it was very tightly sealed in a syringe or a capsule, maybe, and everyone has to learn because no one has the answers on this new product. It's a case of observations, but the observations would be that it's more likely to be a fresh mix of the same batch rather than necessarily a decayed, disposed of
What do we
batch.
get from the fact that it's in a different part of the city? I mean, I suppose they could have moved it themselves, but I mean, does it indicate that perhaps the clear-up wasn't as complete as it should have been?
I don't think this has got anything to do with decontamination whatsoever. It's more likely that if one of the forensic pathways can certainly be that it's been a hostile nation state, and we know that Britain has made a direct accusation to Russia, And that nation-state needs to muddy the waters with lots of stories, lots of different counterpoint views, and to particularly take the international pressure off it for sanctions. If it can raise enough questions in international minds and remove the very tight support that there is for Britain over the Skripals case.
But that would suggest that scientifically it may be very, very difficult actually ever to conclude anything from this.
No, I think the scientists will be able to conclude because at the molecular level, they'll be able to see the level of decay. But the important thing is, internationally, has another team come in and done this particularly to protect the reputation of an international state? Or has it been a supply chain issue where some medical waste has got into the park and been picked up and reused? We just don't know.
Well, both are pretty explosive questions. So thank you very, very much indeed for coming in, Dr. Sally Leavesley. Thank you.